Hi, welcome to another edition of bneReporter with me, Ben Aris, the editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews. There's been protests in high drama in Georgia over the last 3 days. I'm joined today by Mack Tubridy, who's our correspondent in Tbilisi. Hi, Mack. And
Hi there.
We're just going to talk over what's been going on. So the whole thing turns that the government passed, I think it was on Tuesday, in the first reading, foreign agents law, which is the same law that Putin put in place a decade ago. And he's used it in order to suppress the opposition, to get rid of the NGOs that were promoting democracy. He sees it as a fifth column, a way of countries, America, of sneaking in, quote unquote, their version of democracy into Russia. And as such, he sees it as internal interference in domestic Russian politics. And the same charge has been leveled here against Georgian Dream, which is the ruling party in Tbilisi, and that some 85% of the population have adopted or the pro-European transatlantic path that Saakashvili took Georgia in following the Rose Revolution. And they see that Georgia Dream acting as a proxy for the Kremlin here. But Mack, you were saying in a column that it's a bit more complicated. Before we dive into that, let's just catch up on the latest news, because the government said yesterday morning they're going to withdraw the law, and there's a session booked for this lunchtime, I think, where they're actually going to do that. Yet last night, there's still protests going on, isn't there? There's still people on the street. What's happening there? Is this like a Maidan, or is it just the tail end of celebration?
So yeah, the Georgian parliament did withdraw officially the foreign agents bill. So that basically puts, at least for now, a definitive end to that bill. There are people, from what I understand, in front of parliament right now that are protesting more in celebration rather than opposition, because they have shown that they're able to put pressure on the government so that the government would withdraw this bill. So yeah, it's a success story for Georgian civil society in that regard. They showed that they could mobilize society here in Georgia. To me, at first seemed that this foreign agents bill might not lead to such a response as we saw the past week with these mass protests. I was imagining at first that we'd see protests, but not at this scale. And certainly I wasn't expecting there to be clashes between protesters and the police.
How big did the protests get? Because, I mean, the video footage I saw, and there's been repeated demonstrations in front of Parliament over various issues, but it looked large. I mean, it was several thousand people. You were out there. How many people were there?
It was definitely in the several thousands of people. The parliament is situated on the main Rustaveli Avenue in Tbilisi, and the entire main avenue, as well as the front plaza of parliament, were completely packed with people. I don't know what I would what exact number I'd give you, because I'm not able to read crowd numbers, but it was definitely several thousand people.
And to what extent, because I remember the start of Maidan, and that started out on a specific issue, which was the Vilnius summit and the EU deal. Yanukovych was going to do Europe and ended up doing Russia. But I saw a lot of EU flags there. And again, this was a very specific issue, the bill, that people didn't like. But it was also had a very strong pro-Euro element to it. And of course, in Ukraine, what started out as a specific issue transformed into a general, we want to move to Europe, we're fed up with the corruption in the government. And you could argue that Georgia is pregnant with the same issues. There's a potential Maidan here if this transmutes into a more general, we're dissatisfied with the government, we want to go more towards Europe, because the government itself has actually been, or the Georgia Dream specifically, has sat on the fence with Russia. The rhetoric is we support Ukraine, but in practice, nothing's happened. They don't really. But where do they stand on that? How much of this is a pro-European demonstration?
It definitely is a pro-European demonstration, and I think what made that point specifically clear was the criticism from Europe, from the United States against this foreign agents bill. European officials were basically saying that if this foreign agents bill was to be passed by the Georgian parliament, then that could jeopardize Georgia's path to becoming a member of the EU. Of course, they'd first need to become a candidate, and they're still waiting to become a candidate because they were snubbed of candidate status last June. And so Georgia is in this, still in this process of trying to get candidate status. And when Georgian Dream announced that it would back this foreign agents bill, that basically became quite clear that this was either you continue along the European accession route and you don't pass this bill, or you pass this bill into law and you essentially derail accession. Now,
no one actually said that, though, did they? I mean, it's just
nobody said that in explicit terms, but the signaling from European officials, the signaling from American officials too. Of course, the United States is, I mean, not involved in this process directly, but the rhetoric, all the same, did have an effect. And so, yeah, explicitly that was not being said, but that was understood.
So to what extent does Georgian Dream buy into the whole European project? Because, I mean, as you say, last June, Moldova and Ukraine were both offered candidate status. I mean, they are candidate status now, and very glaringly, Georgia was not included in that offer. So it's already backtracked. People in the EU are already unhappy with where it's gone since Saakashvili left. And Ivanishvili, the oligarch, who's basically seems to have captured the whole political process. Is Georgia Dream actually committed to this European thing or not?
It's difficult to say. I think that Georgian Dream is sort of, the options for Georgian Dream are limited here. Constitutionally, Georgia has to aspire to become a member of the EU. It's written in its constitution. So if Georgian Dream was to backtrack on that, it's hard to say. If it were to backtrack on that officially, then it would be violating the constitution. So it has to, at the very least, give this image that they're trying to bring the country closer and closer to the European Union. And I think in some ways they are trying to do that. I think in a sense, they're trying to emulate what Hungary does, where it can, on the one hand, be a part of the European community, but on the other hand, do things that please Russia. That doesn't mean Hungary is pro-Russia. Hungary is pro-Hungary. Viktor Orban is, pro staying in power. And I think that is what we're seeing maybe here in Georgia. Is it's not that the political establishment, it's not that Georgia Dream is pro-Russia. It's pro-Georgia Dream. It's pro-staying in power. It's pro-Georgia. But there's also just this longer, historical process in the past 3 decades of Georgia trying to become a member of the EU. So I don't think it's complicated, because the past year the Georgian Dream has been doing things that do seem to jar with the aspirations to join the EU, and it is looking by many accounts to consolidate its power, which would sort of conflict with this idea of becoming a part of liberal, Western Europe.
So it's more subtle. I mean, tellingly, Orban was on the wire this morning saying that in the future, some point down the road, that he might consider relationships with Russia, sanctioning Russia. And Vučić in Serbia said the same thing. He said he's not ruling out future sanctions. And what you're suggesting then is it's a bit more, well, you can put it another way, is the part of the European project is the values thing. And I've been arguing for a while that, Hungary and Poland too, they want the money and the commerce and the single market and the visa-free, but they don't really buy into the values bit. And you're suggesting the same sort of thing is going on in Georgia. I mean, we had that gay pride, and we have a fight every year. And this year was, or last year was particularly nasty, wasn't it? Because the gay pride office got attacked on the day before, which is not European values. And people are very passionate about their old Orthodox conservative family values.
Correct. Yeah, I think for many Georgians, as you say, it's maybe not an issue of values. It's an issue of becoming, a part of the European Union, and therefore improving their own sort of socioeconomic standing. It is about improving the quality of life, having a higher standard of living. That I think is for many Georgians the main appeal, not necessarily LGBT rights, not these sort of higher flown liberal democratic ideals that are expressed among members of the EU, but maybe not so much in Hungary, of course, and same in Poland.
So what is Ivanishvili's role in all of this? I mean, he made his money in banking and mining in Russia, and he's a pragmatist. I mean, his wealth is equivalent to the entire FDI annual inflow. But he's also nominally pulled back, I think, last year from politics. But everyone, I mean, the opposition people I saw interviewed in front of Parliament yesterday said, look, this is one man, and this is all Ivanishvili, and he wants to cozy up to the Kremlin. But is that true? Is he behind this? Is he pro-Kremlin?
So I would say it's difficult to say what role he's playing here in Georgian politics. I mean, obviously, he being the wealthiest Georgian citizen, Georgian Dream being his political project, he obviously is playing some role, but the specifics of what he's doing are unclear. You could speculate what he's thinking, what his motivations are, what his ambitions are for Georgia's political future, which, I mean, he obviously has a role in all of that. I don't know if he's pro-Kremlin per se. Again, as I was saying before, I don't think this is like a pro-Russia, I don't think you can simplify this to a pro-Russia, pro-Kremlin on the one hand, and a pro-European, pro-Western dichotomy on the other hand. I don't think it's as simple as that. And I can't imagine that he's the kind of person who would simply want to be a tool used by the Kremlin. I mean, he himself is, I mean, he's his own man. He's unlikely the kind of person that you could just describe as the lackey of the Kremlin. He has agency.
So, let me put it to you then. My working hypothesis is that it's pragmatic. I did an op-ed about the geography of diplomacy, and the trouble is, well, Ukraine's right next to the EU, so it's an obvious candidate, and Moldova too. The trouble with Georgia is too far away. And although they aspire to it, that Russia remains, because of its proximity, because of the long cultural and trade ties it has, it pragmatically remains an important economic and security player in the region. And I was in Tbilisi, I interviewed the head of the Georgian Wine Association shortly after the war. And he said, look, we're trying to find new markets for our wine, and we're selling very little to Russia. But we just did a story recently saying that Georgia is now more economically dependent on Russia than it has been at any time since independence. And that's simply because of the trade, that, the market's there, it's easy to sell to. The products like Georgian wine do well there because everyone knows it, does badly in Sainsbury's in London because nobody knows it. And if I was a Georgian leader, I mean, much as you want to distance yourself from Russia, those economic considerations, that just, you have to make money, because Georgia at the end of the day remains a small and poor country. Do you think that's driving it? Is that's where the nuance comes in, the balance, like we need to be nice to the Kremlin, but not so nice because we still want to be good friends with the EU?
I think that's part of it, definitely. Trade with Russia is easier than with many other countries, as you know, just because of the geographic proximity of Georgia to Russia. It's also easier in terms of just language. Georgian traders, they speak Russian, and it's easier to handle all of the bureaucratic details of moving goods to and from Russia and from Georgia. So yeah, there's the element of convenience. I don't know the specific details in terms of how practically difficult it would be to wean off of Russian trade, but who knows? Maybe it's easier than the Georgian government would suggest, but not as easy as the opposition would maybe suggest themselves, because sometimes, just based on what opposition figures say here in Georgia, it seems like you can just flip a switch, right? You can just turn off you can just turn off trade with Russia, and that's obviously not true. But who knows? Maybe it's also not as difficult to gradually ease off of doing trade with Russia.
So as a last question, what happens next? I mean, you're expecting the demonstrations to die away today after they repeal the first reading of this law, and then everyone goes back to normal, or has there been a more significant change?
So I can't say what is going to happen, just because protests tend to have they tend to pop up unexpectedly, like these protests the past week. I'm not sure people were expecting them to be as large and as effective as they turned out to be. I would imagine that mass protests like we've seen the past couple of days, those will probably die down, because the goal of the protesters was achieved. They were able to pressure the government to withdraw the foreign agents bill. But there's definitely discontent. There's dissatisfaction among Georgians with the course of the country's accession to the EU. We'll find out if Georgia is able to meet all of the reform suggestions that the EU gave it back in June, when it said that it couldn't grant Georgia candidate status quite yet, so it needed to implement additional reforms. So we'll find out if Georgia is able to do that later this year. That's when
they haven't made a start on that, because the Ukrainians are boasting they've done 5 out of 6 of the things that they were tasked to do. The Georgia Dream hasn't actually made a pragmatic start on that.
Well, Georgia Dream is going after the lowest hanging fruits. It's going after the easiest stuff that can just be fixed with, technocratic adjustments, and it seems they're putting off the more difficult reform suggestions, which are depolarization in Georgia, political depolarization. I'm not quite sure how they'll achieve that. I mean, that's a massive task that is ahead of them.
Because there's elections next year, isn't there?
There are.
So depolarization, that would be
depolarization. Yeah, and also de-oligarchization is another reform, and that basically means that Ivanishvili will have to somehow disassociate himself from politics, because the problem there is that he has too much influence over the political system in Georgia. So I mean, these are difficult reforms. These are not something that can be achieved so easily. It's not just a matter of wishing Georgia to become more or to become less polarized. I mean, that takes a lot of willpower. Also the European Union needs to be more clear in what it means by some of these reforms. That was one of the criticisms of many people towards these reforms, is they're not always clear in how the EU envisions Georgia fulfilling them and meeting these reform requirements. So it's a two-way street. Georgia has to play its part, and the EU also has to maybe understand the specific context of Georgia and set more realistic expectations.
We've basically run out of time. I want to thank you very much for taking part and giving us useful insight in what's going on. And for those of you out there, you can read Mack's stuff and our own coverage of everything that's happening in Georgia and the wider patch at bne.eu. I recommend you go to bne.eu/welcome. There you can find various goodies we have on offer, including you should sign up to Editor's Picks. It's a daily digest of our best stories. All of this stuff that's been going on in Georgia has been reported in there, free to read, comes once a day. And also, if you're interested in getting more into the weeds, if you're in the game, then you should sign up for a trial to IntelliNews Pro, which is our premium service where we go into the deep details and look at things like the macro of this business, how that's affected, and so on. So once again, until the next one of these, it's bye for me, Ben Aris. Have a good day.